Hello, welcome. This is a video for Chapter 12. This chapter focuses largely on some of the major social reforms that occur between 1820 and 1840. The first reforms we're going to talk about, or actually we're going to be talking about in general, largely abolitionism, but there's also a rise in religious reform and reform in reaction to the market revolution, and also we went over religious reform. Okay, so the first reform we're going to talk about is religious reform, right? There was this idea that a utopia, which is a perfect society, was attainable on earth, right? This is a Protestant idea. Christian communities, they believed that there was something that could be done on earth to live perfectly. And you can see all these communities across the north, largely northern communities, where this is the case. And in these communities, they do away with some of the traditional customs. For instance, marriage, they get rid of. In some cases, we'll talk about the Shakers, and get rid of all private property. These are communities where it's supposed that perfect life is possible. Here we see a picture of the Shakers, right? This is a community of men and women who agreed to celibacy. That's a life without sexual relations. They also agreed to eliminate all private property and ownership. Each did their own, what they could do, and provided for the community. So no money was exchanged. People just helped each other to live. Here they're called Shakers because of the way that they celebrated at religious gatherings. They would do these strange dances where they would shake, hence Shakers. All that's really left of Shakers these days is their furniture, but they are certainly a good example. Some of the other groups that we see in this time period are the Mormons. Joseph Smith writes the Book of Mormon. He believes he's a prophet. And that he's the leader of a new chosen people in America, and he and his followers are kicked out. Now, Mormonism is a major religion today in America. He and his followers are kicked out of his hometown in New York. They're pushed out by angry mobs to Illinois, and again they're pushed out by angry mobs to Utah, which, if you notice, is not actually an American state at the time. And therefore, they try to form their own little country out in the desert. Eventually, of course, they're incorporated into the United States. The major issue with Mormonism, of course, was polygamy, the idea that a man could marry as many wives as he wanted to. There were also unique communities, utopian communities, which were not based on religion, the Owenites, and they were called communitarian. And this is, sort of a factory community. It's based on this factory, and they produce, and all the people in the town share the wealth. It's actually a major failure. It doesn't amount to anything. Another major issue of religious reform is abstinence. That is temperance or abstinence from alcohol. Many Christians at the time believed that drinking alcohol was sort of the work of the devil, and that a person who drank alcohol was not in control of themselves or their senses, and therefore should put it out altogether. It'll become a major, major issue for women's rights later on, when women use it to stop husbands from, or to prevent husbands from beating their wives. We see here, right, the pure bride trying to, and the groom being tempted by alcohol. You see the liquor here on the table. This became very popular, right? You have whole communities in America which even to this day are still alcohol-free communities. It doesn't mean you can't drink alcohol in them, but it is frowned upon, and they do not sell alcohol in their communities. This was a major issue, especially for German and Italians, and largely the Catholic community, right? Catholics were growing in number in the United States, and they were highly opposed to these religious reforms because, unlike Protestants who believed that there was some form of utopia, that peace was achievable on earth, Catholics believed at the time that sin was just a reality, that bad things were a reality, and that there was nothing that could be done about it. and they particularly disliked the laws which they felt were aimed against them in regards to temperance, because part of German, Italian, and French, and many of the Catholic cultures, as well as the Catholic religion, require the use of alcohol, and so banning it seemed like a ban on their culture. Another invention, or several inventions we see of this time from this time period, are asylums. You see an asylum here, the New York House of Refuge. Before this point, largely those who are considered insane or mentally unstable are just hidden away from society. But you see these religious reformers and even social reformers creating the asylum. It's a place to put someone who was not fit for society, but not a criminal. We also see the creation of jails, which at first were intended for reform, right? So one was put in jail not just to sit out a sentence, but rather to be given the opportunity to become a good person, a better person. We also see, I'm sure that you'll appreciate this, not only are asylums and prisons created, but so are schools. Public schools become very popular across the United States. Now, public school had been part of society in New England since the 1640s, but in much of the northern United States, schools were catching on. Public schools were used. The idea was that if people were educated, they'd be less likely to get themselves caught up in stupid situations, and society would be better. Now we're on to abolition. And abolition, the definition of the term abolition is usually refers to getting rid of slavery altogether, just getting rid of slavery.
John Deere, please call 119.
Please
John
ignore
Deere,
that
119.
announcement. There were some people who believed that the only solution to slavery was not to free the slaves and welcome them into American society, but rather the idea of colonization, that if the slaves were to be freed, they would need to be sent away. Now, this is, of course, largely a white idea, but it did actually happen. Thousands of African Americans were freed, and in 1816, they traveled to Liberia. You can see Liberty in the title there. Liberia obviously still exists today. And they named their capital Monrovia after the president in 1816, Monroe. And their goal was to go and start a new society, a Christian society modeled on the United States, but that allowed African Americans to be free. Of course, most Africans were against this idea. They had never been in Africa, especially since the slave trade had been outlawed in 1808. They didn't know Africa, and therefore they didn't want to go there. They wanted to be able to stay in America and be treated as all human beings should be. In comes this man, William Lloyd Garrison, who is probably the founder of the abolitionist movement. He is a devout Northern Christian, and he believes that slavery is a scourge on American society. The reason that America can't find any kind of peace, that there are wars, that Americans are unhappy, is because God is punishing us for slavery. He writes a newspaper called The Liberator, and it is, as early as the 1820s. It's just very clearly against slavery. It speaks out against slavery, and it's the first newspaper to do it. It treats African Americans equally. It allows the African American voice to be spoken. And of course, you can see here it comes out of Boston. That's where the abolitionist movement will be centered. The abolitionists are not just a few people. It's a growing community of people, and they are adamant, right? Just like Garrison believed that it was a punishment from God, so did the abolitionists. You can see that here they're teaching their children the ABCs, and they're using abolitionism and issues of slavery, right? B is a brother with a skin of somewhat darker hue, but in our Heavenly Father's sight, he's as dear as you. Right? You can see it here that they're trying to push these ideas of racial equality and an end of slavery, even to their children at a very early age. We also see them openly criticize the American system. Right here on one side, they're calling it the land of the free, and on this side, they're calling it the home of the oppressed. Right? They're citing the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and saying that America is, really just a giant slave market because it's a slave. There's a major conspiracy of slave states to limit the freedom of African Americans. Sorry, I just have to check the date here. Well, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who you may have heard about, writes a popular book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. You can see here two of the main characters, in which slaves, it's about slaves escaping from their master, and it becomes a major seller. I mean, Harriet Beecher Stowe is from Hartford. We should know that, right? Connecticut hero. And people who had never even considered slavery, never had any thought or interaction with slavery, all of a sudden become very enthused about the cause against slavery by this book. And here's a picture of Harriet Beecher Stowe. I'm thinking of adopting a similar hairdo, if you guys are interested. But where does this racism, this how are the people responding to these abolitionists? What are they doing? Hold on a second. African Americans. Of course, African Americans were also fighting for their rights, but there were just so few of them in the free world, and many of them were deemed not smart enough. I hate to say it that way, but you can see here that there's a comparison. And there were many pseudoscientists, that's a false scientist, scientists who believed at the time that African Americans were a middle species, right? Not actually human, but somewhere in between the chimpanzee, which is down here, and the white person. And therefore, they shouldn't be treated equally because they aren't the same race. But of course, it's not true, right? We know that now, that humans are all almost entirely the same, except for the pigment of skin. You can see here that the abolitionists responded with questions like, am I not a man and a brother? Right? That the phrase brother and sister come from this abolitionist movement. Because your brother and your sister are your equal, no matter how much better you think you are. The federal government was not too particularly protective of abolitionists. They saw them as troublemakers. They said, like Martin Van Buren, they believed that if they could hold off on the issue of slavery, that nothing would have to be done. Eventually, it would just go away, which, we know now is just absolutely ridiculous. The next big issue has to do with women. You can see here a quilt, which is one of the major art forms of the time period, art form dominated by women, of course. Women hold their, convention. They create the Declaration of the Rights and Sentiments of Women. They begin to use the same language that's being used about African Americans and the equality of African Americans to defend their own equality. That women should be treated equally. That they aren't the property of their husbands, but rather have independent thoughts and should be allowed to be treated independently. Largely, these women are laughed at. They're compared to men. They joke that these women are trying to act like men. So they're largely, sort of ignored. But the slave and the women's movements are highly connected. We'll see this throughout the next 100 years of American history, that women and African Americans work together, to try to help each other out. And a couple times they abandon each other, but we'll talk about that later. And you can see that here, right? Just like, am I not a man and a brother? This is, am I not a woman and a sister? Largely, the abolitionists knew that they could not be stopped. You can see here, immediate emancipation is a steam train, and it's going to knock things down. Get off the track, get out of the way. There's really no way around it. That the abolitionists and their fervor for ending slavery is really what brought about the beginning of the end of slavery. And that's about all for Chapter 12. That's what you should be looking for. Of course, you still need to take your notes, and good luck.